Hello and welcome to episode 64 of the official EstablishRun.com podcast. My name is Adam Levitan. I'm one of the co-founders here at ETR. As always, I am joined by fellow co-founder Evan Silva, and today we have a very special guest. This is a young man who appears far too qualified to be talking about mere football. A young man who studied mathematics and mathematical biology at college. I'm not even sure what that is. Got his PhD, I believe, was a professor, and is now the senior data scientist at Pro Football Focus. It is Eric Eager. Eric, what's going on?
Hey guys, it's been a fun ride watching you guys on your podcast. It's a pleasure to be on.
Cool, man. Thanks for being here. Evan, how you feeling, buddy? Draft is behind us. I'm going to talk about a couple of draft kit things in a little bit here, but how you doing?
Yeah, doing well. Excited to chop it up a little bit with Eric. We've had the pleasure to hang out a couple of times in real life at the NFL Combine. It's been a blast, and love talking football with Eric.
Did Sean Payton also tell you that Alvin Kamara is soft, Eric, or did he just tell Evan that in confidence?
That was one of the funniest evenings, because the great thing was about Sean Payton was that he gave Evan the time of day. You know, he didn't brush Evan off. He sat there. He was probably as drunk as Evan, and decided, he was going to explain not only the Alvin Kamara's toughness to him, but the trade up from Marcus Davenport as well. It was quite a sight to behold.
Unbelievable. Okay. The plan for today is to mostly talk at a team level. We're going to talk win totals with Eric. And I think win totals are interesting because it gives us a jumping off point, not to just talk about bets that maybe we like, but also just what we think of these teams going into the season in the wake of the schedule release. And we can talk about how much of an impact that has, et cetera, et cetera. Evan and I will be back later this week to look at Evan's first post-draft top 150. Rosters are pretty much set now. Now I think it really begins for most fantasy people. That podcast will coincide with the release of our draft kit, which will be live later this week. Very exciting time. By the time you hear this, hopefully, draft kit will be up. So head to the site. There's a ton more info about it on there. We're super excited about it. We'll have lots more on it next time when I talk to Evan about his first 150 after the draft. All right. Before we get into it today, though, Eric, I want to ask you a bit about your background. You're obviously very into math. Were you some kind of math prodigy growing up? How did you get into math so much?
Well, I always thought math was interesting and I was good at it. But I've loved football a lot longer than I've loved math. And so, growing up, it was always like doing just enough to keep everybody off my back so I could play football. Interestingly, I was a lot better at math than I was at football. I got a Division II scholarship to play tight end at a school called Minnesota State, which is in the same conference that Adam Thielen played in, and Mark Trestman played at. So it was, I was an okay player. I started for 2 years, but I, obviously had, if I was going to make a career out of football, it was not going to be through playing. But eventually I found that math was a cool way to sort of study things. And so when college was finishing up, I was a little bit, I would say, like, disappointed I didn't study as much as I could. So I went to graduate school. And while I was there, I kind of put football on the back burner for a while. I got a PhD in applied math and, specifically population dynamics, studied diseases and things like that. So, if I was still a math professor, that'd probably be what I would be doing right now. I'd be studying COVID-19, and I went and taught at a school in Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin La Crosse. I taught there for 6 years. And about halfway through, I started doing some writing and sort of consulting work for PFF. And eventually, they needed, to increase sort of their data science footprint. And so myself, my podcast co-host, George Shahuri, some of you guys know really well, Kevin Cole, and Timo Risky, we built the data science group at PFF.
You obviously have a lot of experience that maybe could be useful. Do you ever think to yourself, does anybody ever say to you, why are you wasting your brain, your mathematical training on football? Shouldn't you be out there solving all the world's problems? Everybody's dying, Eric. Shouldn't you be saving them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll tell you guys an anecdote, which is why I don't feel so bad about being in football. So in 2015, 2016, I created a metric uh, to basically find out how many wind turbines you should put up in a basically in any rural area, and it was pretty good and effective enough where it was going to be taken into consideration by by various state and even the federal government, and then for unforeseen circumstances in 2016, it got completely shelved. So to some degree, I do think there are, like, obviously, quote, more important things to do than football, but at the same time, oftentimes those more important things aren't appreciated. And frankly, like, in the time we're at now, as you guys know, providing content and providing entertainment for people when the world frankly sucks a little bit is maybe even more important.
Yep. I want to ask you about how you do your process for win totals. Obviously, one way to do it is to simply say, hey, the market's perception of this team is wrong because XYZ. And I actually think with win totals, you can beat the market like that. Like, it's not nearly as efficient as, say, a regular season NFL game, closing line. Like, I actually do think that Evan has the ability and the knowledge depth to, like, see things that aren't priced into the market. Of course, there's also a more mathematical way to do it, which I assume, I didn't talk to Eric about it, but I assume Eric has a more mathematical way. Eric, why don't you explain your approach, your process for looking at and making bets on NFL win totals? And by the way, for people that don't know, all win total means is a bet on how many games X team will win this season.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I do agree with you that there are folks, that can look at a team, look at a schedule, and sort of be contrarian or even be ahead of the marketplaces we've seen. Like, we've only had the schedule for a week, but I've made a series of bets on win totals just by basically, trying to understand how the market will move once everything is put together. But my baseline process is basically to use some of the power rankings we build at PFF, and whether that be, how good a team's coverage is, how good a team's pass rush is, how anti-fragile a team is. So I wrote an article about 2 months ago, kind of inspired by COVID, frankly, about how, when you look at how good a defense is, it's actually the fifth highest graded coverage player that has the biggest impact on how a team will do in a game. And so there are various things where, there are exploitable edges, and you can build them either, and there are plenty of people who are smart and can sort of intuit all those things. I try to build them into a model, and then simulate the season, of tens of thousands of times, and see how the distribution goes, spreads out, and see how big of an edge you would have if you bet a win total doing that. And that's basically my process, and it evolves a lot. I mean, when I first started doing this, it was just baseline power rankings. Now it incorporates a lot of things like, what's the rest differential? Now I think Warren Sharp talked about that this week, but like going out to two opposite coast games is no longer as bad as it was before, because teams will, stay on the West Coast if they're an East Coast team and so on. But yeah, it's basically building all the things that, we all talk about already into a model and then simulating it a bunch of times to see how it ends up shaking out.
All right. So what we're going to do here is we're going to bring up some teams. Eric sent us some teams that he wants to talk about. I have a couple teams I want to talk about with you guys. Evan has some teams. We're going to start with the Baltimore Ravens, and I'm going to read the DraftKings lines. These are Canby lines. Canby is just the odds provider for DraftKings for those guys that don't know, and they're pretty widely available. And I think you guys should be shopping for the best available line when you want to make a bet. But I think just as something that's widely available, we're going to talk about DraftKings lines. Ravens currently 11 win total. Over is minus 125. Have to lay 125 to win 100 to get over on the Ravens. 11 wins. Under is plus 103. Eric, talk to me about the Ravens.
Yeah, the Ravens are an interesting team in that I do think firmly that they are one of the best organizations in football and have been for quite some time. But there's some fragility to the Ravens that I think people are not pricing in. I mean, this started at 11.5. It's gone down to 11. So there's certainly, some money, I think, some appetite for the under. But even at 11, it's really hard for, like, let's say a simulation to play out and for a team to have a median of, let's say, 11, 12 wins. And it's just because of there's a ton of things that can go wrong. And the Ravens, I think, unlike maybe Kansas City, which is like sort of concentrated on coach quarterback, I think the Ravens are sort of good at everything, which is great when everything works. That's how you get a 14-2 season. But there are a number of things I think that can go wrong where the payout for an under here, I think, is so much more substantial than the payout for an over, given the odds that, either of them happen.
Yeah. Evan, Ravens obviously one of the best teams in the NFL last season. What do you think? One thing I'll talk about in a minute what I think about this one, but Ravens are going to be not sneaking up on anybody this year. People will have a full season to prepare for the way they played last year. What do you think about the Ravens at 11 wins?
I think just at so many wins, they're not a bet. If they get down to 10.5, then I think we're talking. And I think we come back and hit the over there. But and it definitely helps that according to projected win totals this year, which is not, based on last year's win-loss record, which I still can't believe that people in the media use last year's win-loss percentages to project 2020, the following year strength of schedule. I can't believe that people, every time I see that, I'm like, what are you thinking? But just in terms of projected win totals based on the, sports book lines, which are made more efficient by the market, which is really probably the best way to do strength of schedule at this point, just from a simple way to do it. I think, the Ravens have the easiest schedule in the NFL this year. So, I think that their offseason was interesting. They pumped a lot of resources into run defense. They used, and I think that was maybe a reaction of how they just got trampled by Derrick Henry in the playoffs. I do like that they added Calais Campbell, though he's a good run defender and a good pass rusher. They used a fairly, significant draft pick on J.K. Dobbins just to upgrade Gus Edwards. Like, how much better? I mean, Gus Edwards averaged like 5.5 yards per carry last year. How much better can J.K. Dobbins really do than Gus Edwards? Obviously, J.K. Dobbins is a better player, but how much is he really going to move the needle? They lost Marshall Yanda up front at right guard, and really both of their guard spots, I think, are a little bit questionable. Actually, their center position is too as well. So all three positions on the interior, I think, have some question marks. I'd really like to see them sign Larry Warford, who seems like a Ravens signing because they love to sign guys that got cut and won't count against their compensatory pick process the next year. But right now it's too many wins. Even after it got bet down from 11.5 to 11, but I think that if it gets to 10.5, because their schedule is so soft, because they are returning, I like, this year in particularly, I like to bet on continuity. They're bringing back the same defensive coordinator, Wink Martindale. They're bringing back the same offensive coordinator, Greg Roman, who's one of the best in the league. A ton of their personnel is coming back. And, I think that if it gets down to 10.5, then I think we hammer the over.
Yeah, I kind of think their schedule last year played out in a way that was so favorable. I mean, think about what was going on in the AFC North last year. The Steelers were an absolute train wreck with Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges. The Bengals were an absolute beyond train wreck. I mean, Andy Dalton didn't even survive. They had so many injuries. The Browns were just a total mess. I think the Browns have a chance to bounce back. The Ravens last year also got to play Miami, who wasn't even trying for a lot of the year. Arizona, the Rams, the Jets out of division. They had a plus 10 turnover differential. So, I think there's a lot of factors last year that led to the Ravens going 14-2. I would certainly lean under here. But as Evan said, it's scary because their schedule for this upcoming year is very easy. They play the NFC East. They play the AFC South. It's interesting. But yeah, and certainly I think a more fragile team than most, as Eric alluded to. Let's get to the Bills, who Evan and I have already spent a lot of time talking about. If you go back to our long shots bets before, I think Bills to win the AFC, Tre'Davious White to win Defensive Player of the Year, and Josh Allen when he was like 60-1, 65-1 to win MVP were all interesting. Now I think the market's responding a little bit here, and people are starting to warm up to the Bills. Their odds to win the division was available at plus 160, plus 170 not too long ago. Now you're lucky to find plus 130, plus 135. Their win total is 9 over plus 1.